Hello students, today I am going to explain the lesson 1 history, tracing changes through 1,000 years. I am going to specifically focus on the sources of history from this lesson. In this module, I am going to cover what is history, what is the difference between a history book and a storybook, why is it important to study history, what are the sources of history, what are the different kinds of sources of history, why history has been divided into time periods, what are the traditional sources of history, and what are the new sources of history. In this module, we are mainly going to focus on the question, how do historians and archaeologists investigate history? As we are mainly going to focus on the various sources of history. So what is history? History is an investigation. The word history comes from the ancient Greek word historia, which means investigation. Understanding that history is an ongoing investigation or inquiry is the key to this subject. It is important to study history because it is about thinking, understanding, and developing research and other skills that are useful in life. Historians use all the tools of science, maths, literature, economics, geography, and more to help resolve the riddles of the past. In this way, historians are like time detectives. So now we'll see why history is an investigation. So as we have discussed, historians use an inquiry approach when they investigate controversies and mysteries of the ancient past. They conduct research to gather evidence from a range of sources, evaluate the usefulness of the sources, and analyze the evidence they gather from them. So this explains that history is not a work of fiction. It is a work which is non-fiction and which is written, a historical account is written on the basis of a lot of research which is conducted by the historians. In many cases, when he's investigating the ancient past, some of the evidence is missing. For this reason, historians need to piece together the past from various types of sources of history, kind of like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle that is missing some of its pieces. So now we need to differentiate between what is a history book and a storybook. A history book is a true account of events that happened in the past that led to new developments which influence mankind till today. These accounts are written by historians after analyzing the sources of history. Whereas a storybook, just like a Panchatantra tale, is a work of imagination and fantasy which tells us moral stories and tells us what is right and wrong. On the other hand, a history book tells us what has happened in the past and to learn from our mistakes and not to repeat those mistakes in the future. For the sake of convenience, the history has been divided into two parts, prehistory and history. Prehistory is a period of the time when no literary sources were available, which means man had not learned to read or write. And then history, the second part of the history has been divided into history, for which we have written or literary sources. For example, inscriptions, coins, manuscripts. So they are written in written form, and historians analyze these written sources to rewrite those accounts of history. Now, history has on the basis of the written sources that the historians have found, they have divided history into further three parts: ancient history, medieval history, modern and contemporary history. Here are the types of sources or evidence that the historians use. For example, artifacts such as human remains, skeletal remains, pottery, weapons, tools, coins, and art. Such artifacts are mainly useful for finding about more about the prehistoric times like the Stone Ages, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic periods, and also the ancient period also, because many of the civilizations still today, the manuscripts of such civilizations have not been deciphered by the historians. For example, the Brahmi script of the Harappan civilization is still not deciphered by the historians. So the artifacts that tell us more about those times and how what was the lifestyle of people during those times. The written sources which have been uh, uh, analyzed by the historians, they include inscriptions, stone carvings, tablets, then copper plates, then inscriptions on the walls, on the clay tablets, wood, and paper. Now, the historians have analyzed these sources, read through these sources, and then they have made a comparison of those sources of the same times, and then they have written an account of history of those particular times. Similarly, we have the images in the form of paintings, photographs from recent history, paintings of the medieval times and before that. Even during the prehistoric times, we have the cave paintings of the primates in many parts of the world. Apart from that, there are other histories from the past which have been passed down from one generation to other, which is known as the oral tradition. For example, the dance forms and the ceremonies and rituals, the songs, the mythological stories, they are all called the oral traditions, which also tell us more about those times in the past. So here is this picture which gives you more examples of the sources of history. For example, the earlier maps and diagrams, remains of buildings, remains of shipwrecks, statues, translations of works of ancient writers, preserved body or skeletons, photographs and reconstructions, ancient inscriptions, graffiti on the walls, or paintings on the walls, just like in the cave paintings by the primates in the prehistoric times. Now, what other people have written, for example, the prashastis and the inscriptions which were written to glorify the kings of those times, figurines, statues, tools, stone tools. For example, during the Paleolithic, during the Stone Age, we have the three varieties of tools. When we had the megaliths, then we had the small microliths were there. So they tell us why the tools, the size of tools changed with the changing technology and the invention of fire. Then pottery and cups, tombs. Tombs means the graves of the dead, and the coins of those different times, mosaics, weapons, paintings and carvings in tombs and caves. So these are the various varieties of sources the historians study to analyze the events that would have happened in those times. And there are various scientific methods. For example, the carbon 14 dating is also utilized to determine the exact date of that artifact, to find out more about which period it belonged to. And that's when the historians, after a great deal of research, they write the historical accounts of history. What are the different types of artifacts? We have tools and utensils. Archaeological evidence indicates there was a significant increase in the creation of artifacts such as pottery from around 5,000 years ago. They include tools and utensils to hold water, oil, or grain. You can see some tools here also, some microliths for cutting the, cutting and slicing. Then we have other types of artifacts. This is an example of a cave painting from France in the Lascaux caves in France. They were painted by the hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe between 20,000 and 9,000 years ago. Archaeologists think early rock art may have been a magical ritual to ensure success in an important activity such as a hunt. So this way, in the paintings, it is depicted how the primates used to plan their hunt. We have art forms here, different art forms. They also tell us about their festivals, the gatherings and the celebrations. Then when we talk about the other artifact sources, we have the inscriptions and the prashastis in the form of writings. Scholars think that writing began as an attempt by people to keep visible records of trading. These might be notches made on bones or arrangements of pebbles or sticks. The ancient Sumerians in the Middle East produced the first script around 3500 BC. Other scripts developed in Egypt, China, India, and Mesoamerica are areas from modern-day central Mexico to northern Costa Rica. As scripts developed, the more privileged people in different societies might have had inscriptions made on their tombs. These inscriptions, as well as tomb paintings and figurines, have provided historians with a wealth of information about the beliefs and the everyday lives of people of those times. So here are some other sources, some other artifacts of history we can see here. This is an inscription, then there's a manuscript on paper. So these are the various sources of written inscriptions. Then when we talk about oral traditions, just like I was telling you, tribal stories, folk tales, paintings on the cave walls, and apart from that, mythological stories like Ramayana and Mahabharata, the rituals, ceremonies, they are all oral traditions which tell us more about the history of those times. And here are some types of images from the recent times. These are photographs that tell us more about the histories of the contemporary times. These are pictures from the Second World War. And here is a picture of a Negro during the times of slave trade in Africa. When we talk about archaeology, archaeology is the study of the remains of the past. So archaeology is something which is related to history. Historians write history on the basis of the study of the archaeological uh, artifacts. So now the study of the remains of the past is known as archaeology. Archaeologists locate and uncover sources of evidence of past and peoples. This can include skeletal remains, the ruins of buildings and tombs, artifacts they made such as pottery, weapons, tools, and coins, inscriptions and stone carvings, rubbish dumps, etc. Apart from that, some archaeologists even work underwater to find these ancient remains from the ancient shipwrecks. Suppose there is a shipwreck in the oceans, so they go underwater also to find out the artifacts, just like it is shown in the picture. Archaeologists exploring the wreck of a ship that sank in the Mediterranean Sea during the 11th century. Now, what do archaeologists do? They do the excavation. Most sources found on land are buried. They are buried inside the layers of the earth. They might be covered by soil from floods or by sand blown by the wind or overgrown by dense jungle. Some lie beneath other buildings built over time on the site. Archaeologists work to locate and excavate artifacts and other sources of evidence. Once archaeologists have located an historical site, they think may provide important artifacts and information about the past. It is roped off from the public. Roped off from the public means these sites are, people are prohibited to enter these sites, and the archaeologists, they start working on removing the layers and dig out the archaeological remains. These sites are referred to as archaeological digs, just like it is shown in this picture here. When excavating an archaeological dig, great care is taken to remove the underlying rocks and dirt, sometimes even using teaspoons and small brushes. Once an artifact is fully exposed and excavated, the archaeologists photograph and number it and records details of its description and the exact location where it was found. So now, when the sources are found, they are further divided into primary sources and secondary sources. So what is a primary source and what is a secondary source? A primary source is a first-hand account, record, or evidence about a person, place, object, or an event. Think that I was there. Primary source, which means you were present there and you have written that account. So that is known as a primary source. So if a historian from the medieval times, let's say Al-Biruni was there during the time of Muhammad Ghazni. So he has written an account about the Prithviraj Chauhan in India and the Battle of the Rains. So he was a primary source and he's written those accounts because he was witness to them. So that is known as a primary source. A secondary source is an account, record, or evidence that comes from an original or primary source, which means in present times, when historians go through the accounts of Al-Biruni or Prithviraj Raso written by Chand Bardai, when they go through both the accounts, they will evaluate what were the actual events that were there, and then they will rewrite the entire account. So that becomes a secondary source, second of history that we refer to. I heard or learned about somebody and then I presented it again. So here is a list of primary sources: autobiographies, diaries, documents, eyewitness accounts, film footage, laws, letters, video recordings of actual events, minutes of to meetings. So these are like, we are talking about the sources which are in the present times. In the old times, we did not have internet. We did not have even the paper was not there. So with the changing times, there are certain traditional sources of history that the historians use. And now we are creating new source of history, which are the contemporary sources of history. For example, objects from today's times, photographs, poems, speeches, interviews, manuscripts, newspapers, maps, podcasts, voicemail messages, paintings, and inscriptions, writing carved in stone. So ancient Greek law inscribed in stone and war diaries. So you can make out the difference between a traditional source of history and the source of history from present times after the coming of paper or the invention of the printing press. Now, there are some examples of the secondary sources are the history books that you're reading. From the present history books, you get to know about history. So these are the secondary sources because these books are written after what the historians have written. They have been analyzed, and from them, the information has been analyzed and has been presented to you. Then encyclopedia, print and online, biographies, reference books, non-fiction, history books, editorials, journals, articles of today's times are all secondary sources. So children, this brings us to the end of this offline lecture on the sources of history from lesson 1, tracing changes through 1,000 years. Thank you.